Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I'm your host, Michael Manley, and I am thrilled to be welcoming my good friend and colleague, Tammy Noreyko, to the show today. Tammy is the Secretary Treasurer of American Federation of Musicians Local 7 in Orange County, California. Welcome, Tammy.
Hey, thank you. It's good to see you, Michael.
You too. I'm always really inspired by your story of how you got into helping working musicians. And it started with you actually not being a musician yourself, but being a fan, right? So can you take us back to the time when you were in LA, checking out some of those early independent and punk bands and rock bands, and how you initially got interested in helping musicians?
Sure. Well, like you said, I'm a huge music fan and fan of musicians, of course. Back in the late 70s, I think when I got my first car, I headed straight to Hollywood to see all the bands playing there. And I enjoyed like all the different styles, reggae, ska, especially rock and roll. And I would go, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. We were up there, my friends and I would go and see the bands play. And I knew a lot of those guys, before they became famous, some of those guys that have really been turned into rock stars after that.
Like who? Can you give us some examples?
Have you heard of Quiet Riot?
Oh, yeah.
Quiet Riot. Yeah, I knew Kevin DeBro. Randy Rhoads, the Cavazo brothers, they were in Quiet Riot. There was the thing that really got me is, I would go and pay an admission, go see these bands. We have a great time. And a lot of times the bands would be, before the show, they would be out on the sidewalk selling tickets to their show. And one time I met this one musician. He was in a band called Squeeze. I don't know if you remember the band Squeeze. They played that song, something about coffee. And I can't think of it right now. But anyways, it became pretty famous. And I was surprised that he had to sell tickets in order to perform at the club.
Yeah.
They had to sell at least 200 tickets. Otherwise, they wouldn't let him perform, which I thought was crazy. Or they had to, pay money to be able to perform at this club. And I just always thought I was paying, my admission was going towards the musicians who were getting paid to perform, like they were, that's what they did for a living, and they got paid to do such a thing. And I was really taken aback by the idea that they had to pay to play or sell tickets. They had to fill the house. So that, I just thought that was such an injustice. I just couldn't fathom such a thing. And they thought, well, that's how it is around here. And I couldn't believe it. I also didn't know what I could do to help that or to change that, or there has to be something that, somewhere someone can help them. So that stuck in my head, for years.
Yeah.
And then I went, fast forward, I was in business. I was in mortgage banking and a lot of different businesses, administration. And I ended up working at the Musicians Union. I got this job at the Musicians Union. I was telling my friend, I need to go get out of corporate America and go somewhere where I can make a difference, and somewhere where it's, not just a bunch of politics. So I ended up at the Musicians Union, which I honestly didn't know there was a Musicians Union. I was, raised in a union family. My dad was a union plumber. I knew about unions. I and he was a proud union member, even though he ended up being an owner, corporate owner, employer, but he was pro-union. Everybody was in his shop. So I thought, I didn't know there was a musicians union. So when I got there, then I thought, oh, now I see where I could maybe make a difference. and the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, that's a great entry into being an advocate for working musicians. And at your current position as secretary treasurer, you basically are the sort of the engine that keeps the local running. And are you involved with any negotiations or anything like that in your work?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I not only do I run the business of the local, but I also am involved in every aspect. We have a small staff. There's
Hmm.
only three of us that work full time at the local, so I'm involved with every aspect, including I'm on the negotiations teams for all the contracts. Um, I run the referral service. When people call in and want to hire musicians, I'm the one they talk to. Um, yeah, I'm an activist. I get the musicians, you know, engaged in their work in the union. I set up all the meetings. I cater all the food.
Yeah, that's the important part, right?
Yeah. Free food gets them in.
Yeah. So you have a lot of different types of employment in your local. Like, so you have at least one symphony, right? You've got the Pacific Symphony, which is an orchestra in Orange County, and then you also have Disneyland. You have musicians on Disneyland. What are some of the other types of music that you represent there in Local 7?
Yeah, we have. There's a show in Laguna Beach called the Pageant of the Masters.
Love it.
Isn't it great? It's really unique, and it's a pageant of on the stage they show these tableaus of masterpieces, classical masterpieces like the Last Supper, say. But instead of just a painting, there's live people standing in their place. And there's a pit orchestra that plays music along when they show. They have a narrator that talks about the piece, but they also have a pit orchestra, and it's an outdoor event venue. So that's a unique job. We have several other smaller orchestras in the area. We
Hmm.
have some choral agreements with some choral organizations that use musicians. One of them is playing at an aquarium tomorrow night, so they'll be playing at the fish aquarium in Long Beach tomorrow night.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a lot of different agreements that we have with employers in our area.
Yeah. And for somebody who's watching who might be entering the field, wondering how these contracts get negotiated, what is the role of the musicians in that within your local?
Oh well, the musician, it's their contract, so the musicians are an integral part of the process. So the myself and the president and our board, we're all elected from the membership, but we are there to provide the infrastructure and the knowledge and advice to the musicians. But the musicians usually form that are working under each contract form a committee, a negotiating committee usually, and they go about doing most of the work of the negotiating. We might have an attorney to do this, as a spokesperson for our side, for the musician side, but the musicians are the ones that decide what they want from the contract, what improvements they want, what changes they need, and they're the ones that speak to those issues at the negotiating table. So
Yeah.
they all come together. They might not all be at the negotiating table at the same time, but we invite all of them that are in the bargaining unit to participate and vote on the contract. So they all have to agree and vote on it.
Yeah.
At the
I
end.
think that's a really good process you have there. I mean, members owning their contract and owning the process is really key.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not my contract, but
Right.
I provide like I said, the infrastructure and the the space for them to come together virtually and physically. They can come and use our hall. And we also we survey all the musicians. We find out what they want from the contract. And if there's not a contract, we also work to organize the musicians working under for that employer, so that we can be recognized as the bargaining agent for the musicians, and then get a contract with the employer in the beginning. It has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And have you been, with your long tenure there at Local 7, have you been part of a lot of new organizing where you have an orchestra or a group of musicians that are, wanting to improve their work life and forming a union?
We haven't had I was lucky that we have a lot of contracts for just about every employer in the area already. We have been able to increase our bargaining unit, like at Disneyland. That was a really great success that they had this last bargaining session. At Disneyland, there's during the Christmas time, there's a parade of student musicians, or they were called student musicians. And back in the day, perhaps there were students that were on their winter break from school, and they would play music in this parade. Well, it had gone on so long that they were actually the musicians had graduated, whatever school they were in, and they stayed working there. They were working well outside of any winter break. So they came to us and said, we're actually not students. We are working musicians, and we want to be included in the collective bargaining unit, and have the same protections and the same benefits and all that that is included in that contract. So we did organize about 25 drummers and trumpeters that all came together, and we helped them organize themselves, actually, and we got them into the contract. So we negotiated that. They showed up at the table. They said they told their story, and the employer had they had no argument. They basically had to agree that, yes, you're right. You guys should be part of that. So that's one great recent success that we've had.
Yeah, I think you as a local are a really good model for allowing the workers to be their voice. And that's something that if you have a strong personality and you think, well, I can do this on my own, I can do it, right? But it takes a certain amount of humility to say, you know what, Disney in this case needs to hear from the workers. They don't need to hear from me. And I think during the pandemic, we saw a lot of negotiations happening on Zoom and virtual spaces because nobody could meet. And that was actually really positive, I thought, for at least in our sector, probably other sectors as well, because you actually had musicians who could show up. If the negotiation is physically in Los Angeles or something, you're not going to have a lot of workers that are going to be able to take off work and get there. But if you have a virtual negotiation, you actually have a lot of workers showing up. So I think in our industry, that was really transformative for our media workers, especially in some of the major media negotiations we had.
Yeah, that really made a difference for us, especially for the Disney contract. We had the musicians were actually able to attend the negotiations on Zoom, even while they were at work. During their breaks, they would get on Zoom, and you would see them, the group of them, in the break rooms, in the band rooms. They were all participating, and I think that made a huge impact on our negotiations, and really gave them agency over the contract. It wasn't just negotiated in closed doors. It wasn't just our president and our attorney and me, cutting a deal,
Yeah.
Disney wouldn't even, they wouldn't have taken us as seriously as they did, because the musicians were using their voice to share their stories, I could talk till I'm blue in the face about what I think the musicians need, but it doesn't have the same impact, So it was really it was really awesome to have everybody in the room virtually, and then in caucus, so you go into these break rooms, and the musicians were really like, they were owning it, and it was just, God, it was just, I was almost in tears, just so happy that they got it, and they saw the power that they had together. So that
Yeah.
was really awesome. They had, there was one point where they were offered different tiers of money for something, and they all said no. We all deserve the same thing, no matter what. So they all said no. They told the employer no. They got what they wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really awesome. So, and now they know it's their contract. It wasn't negotiated by me, or I'm there just to help them. Show them the ropes, show them how it's done. This is what and then give them the 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 table. You got yeah. It was great.
Yeah, that's a great example of workers owning their power and having a voice. I want to just pause for a couple comments we've got. It says, good afternoon, Mike and Tammy. I don't see who the user is, but thank you, whoever is watching. And Jim Neglia, who was my guest 2 weeks ago now, a contractor on the East Coast and personnel manager, is asking us a hard question. I love hard questions.
Oh.
So he says, hi, Tammy and Michael. I'm absolutely pro-union. However, I'm finding it more and more difficult to keep up with the rising union fees. Pension in New York is 18.99%. LA is high, as are most larger cities. Do you see this as a potential problem for music coordinators and contractors to keep promoting the use of union orchestras? That was a mouthful. So do you have any feedback on that, Tammy?
Well, expenses go up for everybody. The cost of a loaf of bread has gone up for everybody. We all need to pay our bills. There are employers that want to cut back expenses when they do big productions. Like for instance, the latest one in New York was David Byrne's show that he just wanted to go to tape. But if you're going to be in that business, you have to understand that expenses increase over the years, no matter what. It's not just the musicians that their costs are increased, but everything increases. Like the stage, the venue, the props, everything you use, the dancers, the actors. You know what I mean? It's not just the musicians' expenses that increase. Everyone should expect that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think Jim's probably correct about major cities, right? The fees probably are increasing. In my experience, I feel like the reverse is true sometimes in smaller markets where, the fees maybe are not as where they should be. And so I think it would depend on the kind of coordinating and contracting. Obviously, if you have symphonic work and it's orchestras and they're nonprofits, that's a different animal than talking about for-profit businesses like Disney or something.
Oh, sure.
But I would just use the example of like touring Broadway, where if we have a show, let's say it would be, I don't know, let's say it's a tour of Phantom of the Opera. And let's say they're hiring 10 local musicians all around the country. They might have very high rates to pay in Chicago or LA for those musicians. But there are some cities where the theater rates are just not where they should be. And they're paying maybe like $100 a person per show, which is very, very low. So I actually think that it's kind of all over the map. And, I think that's a different problem than Jim is outlining. But I think, I think the fees are increasing in those bigger cities, but so are the costs. And I just remember thinking about San Diego just had an audition for their orchestra, and I have a colleague who got a teaching gig in San Diego, and she and her husband are looking for houses out there, and there's just nothing under like $1 million in San Diego. And I'm
Right.
thinking, how does somebody live on what they make in the San Diego Symphony in San Diego? Like, how do you, or even Orange County, you guys just had a horn opening for the Pacific Symphony. And it's like, could somebody move across the country and live on what they pay? That's a different issue, right? Because it's a nonprofit, but still, these are real problems. And I also think one of the things that sometimes producers don't think when they just see a number on a page and they say to a contractor like Jim, well, this is really high. It's like, well, you're talking about not full-time employment. You're talking about needing people who are really good to execute the role that you want to hire them for and in delivering this music. And if we're not fair to them and treat them with the respect they deserve financially, then we're not going to have them again, because we're not talking about somebody who's making this rate for 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year or whatever it might be. So I think that's part of it too, is just changing
Yeah.
the thinking about the employment.
Yeah, that's true. They're just there for that one run or that one production. You know, they're trying to piece together a full career for their
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Yeah, and also the difference between for profit and nonprofit, that's huge. You know,
yeah,
the nonprofit symphonies, they they don't make all their money on ticket sales. You know, they make most of the money on donations. So
yeah,
they're on the hook for that. And when the musicians are, you know, they want the best musicians, and the only way you can be your best is if you know, put in the time and you deserve, you know, the right pay for that, and you shouldn't have to take a cut because the symphony is not raising enough money. You know, that's their business basically, to raise money to present the music to the people. So,
yeah. And Jim might appreciate this story, but I was working. I think I was in the media department. I've worked a lot of different jobs within the AFM, and um, there was a premiere of a season of Game of Thrones. It was one of the earlier seasons, and they were wanting to hire the whole cello section of the New York Philharmonic to do this big thing. And the New York Philharmonic said, well, we have media rates and we have our own symphony rates. We just want to use this and use our contract for it. And I said, well, who's producing this? And they said, well, it's HBO. And I said, well, they can't use your contract. They have to pay these other rates, which are higher. And they said, well, why? Like, why can't we just, it's like, well, because you're a nonprofit that doesn't make money,
mhm.
right? And HBO makes billions of dollars. So no, we can't use a rate that was negotiated in the context of a nonprofit for a for-profit company. And there is a kind of, I think, in the for-profit world, just a kind of default um, behavior of wanting the lowest rate, right? Like people just want the lowest rate. It has nothing to do with how much money they're going to make on the back end. It's just we want this. We want to find the cheapest thing we can do, right? It's just capitalism. So I think we sometimes have to make the case that, like, if you want quality and if you want this to be where it needs to be, you're going to have to pay a higher price, and you can afford it as a for-profit company, I should say.
Get
I
what you pay for.
Yeah, I think where it gets gray is when you have people that are trying to launch an artist, maybe somebody who doesn't have quite the name, and they really are not sure how they're going to do financially, and so there is sometimes that friction between, somebody who genuinely is like, well, we're not really sure how much money we're going to make on this, and we're not Disney, and so can you work with us? So I think, though, that most outside of big major cities, I think that the reverse is almost true, that the rates are probably lower than they should be. But it is a real issue, I think, in big cities.
Right. Yeah, and it does make a difference, like you said, between the type of work that's being offered. If it's a one run of a show versus full time work somewhere. You know, like in Orange County, the work, the wages that the musicians make at Disneyland it's a totally different model than what they make at the symphony. You know,
Hmm.
right now the symphony is still a per service orchestra, so they get paid for each service that they're hired. At Disney, they get it's shift work. You get hired for 7 hours a day, and you get put on this schedule, And because if you're a full-time person, you may also get medical insurance and vacation and sick, just like some other, corporate job. But most, which is a different type of work for musicians than any other work they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it really depends on the type of work that's being offered, the amount of work. If there's a guarantee of so much work, you might cut a deal for the hourly or the service rate, But yeah, it really depends on the type of work and how much work is being offered and whether it's nonprofit, profit, for profit.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, speaking from the worker side of it, right, is that often musicians don't have a context for what they should make. So if somebody's playing the Pacific Symphony as a substitute, they might get a certain rate per service, right? But if they're playing in, the Staples Center, backing up Lady Gaga, they shouldn't be making that same rate, right? That's not appropriate because the model economically is totally different. But musicians often don't think about that. They don't think like, well, what should I be making and what's fair? And that's where I think education from locals can be really helpful, to say, well, this is why we have a rate that's for a for-profit arena artist versus a symphony.
Yeah, or a funeral or a backyard party. I've had a lot of musicians that I've talked to and helped over the years they've been a musician for 40 years and they still aren't sure of how much to charge,
Yeah.
So we do have every union sets their own minimums, but we always encourage folks to get, you have the right to negotiate anything higher than that, and they should.
Yeah.
They're professionals, they've studied their craft, even longer than some doctors have,
Right. So yeah, absolutely.
So when you hire someone for an hour wedding ceremony, you want it for $100, but you don't realize that to get someone to show up and be professional and play that beautiful wedding ceremony music, it doesn't come out of thin air, right? They've had they're professionals and they've studied and they've honed their craft. So they deserve to get the higher rate.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim says you hit the nail on the head. Detroit project 17,000, same show in Boston 28,000. Yeah, I mean,
depends on the market.
Yeah. It's probably, I think Boston might be as bad as New York and San Francisco as far as cost of living. I remember it's not a cheap city. So there's a context for all of those things. I wanted to ask you, Tammy, because you have been working for quite a long time, your whole career almost, in labor advocacy for working musicians. Has there ever been like a strike on your watch there, and with any of the groups that you work with, and what are some of like the major kind of like keystones of your time there in Orange County that you recall?
So we haven't been on strike, but we've gotten close a number of times. We've been in negotiations up to the 11th hour sometimes, and the musicians would hold fast, and they would end up winning what they wanted. I have been on several informational picket lines, especially for the Broadway show stuff at our main venue, the major venue that we have here. There were some Broadway shows that would come to town, and instead of hiring a full orchestra, they would maybe have 11 musicians, and then the rest was using virtual orchestra or some electronic contraption that would make it sound like there was a big orchestra there. So we had I've made lots of signs in my day. Beauty and the Beast and a few other shows where we tried to inform the public. And there were some that folks that would turn away, but for the most part, they had already bought their tickets and were like, you're paying the same amount to hear, half a show. So I've done a lot of walking the picket lines, and with other unions too. We have a great relationships with other unions. We have coalitions out here where we walk the strike lines for other unions too. As my personal opinion, as being an activist, I will walk the line with other unions. There's one happening right now at Medieval Times in Buena Park, where they've been on strike for about 120 days now.
Mm.
Yeah, so there's standing strong though. But yeah, I've done that before. I've a lot of informational pickets to our musicians to let them know what's happening, and because a lot of times they just keep their head down, they go to work and they come back, they get paid, they don't pay attention to what's happening, but we try to get them engaged and involved in their work and their contract. And that's a lot of what I've done over the years is try to get the musicians involved. It's not my contract, like I said.
Yeah.
So,
one of the things that I love about your local is that, you're not the only one, right? But you're a good example of the fact that you understand that we're working artists, right? That we're working musicians, and that we're part of a larger labor community. And one of the sort of things that we sometimes fall down on is supporting our other working colleagues, right? So an orchestra will get to the point where maybe things break down and they have to go on strike. But they've made no relationships with other workers. They've not shown up for their pickets or their actions. And then they say, okay, everybody needs to help us, right? We need everybody to be on board. And it's like, but where have you been and who are you and why are you just now talking to us? So I think building those relationships and standing with workers in all fields is really key. And are you guys involved at all with the writer's strike, which is, of course, the biggest thing happening in California right now, probably?
Yeah, that's there are a number of unions that are going to negotiate with the AM PTP coming up. So there's a lot of coalition building going on right now. I haven't personally been up to LA to walk that picket line because I've been busy at the office, but our musicians are going out there. The LA musicians are definitely out on the strike line. But in Orange County, I'm a delegate to the Orange County Labor Fed. So I go to all those meetings and the House of Labor. So I know about all the other unions that are on strike. The UC University of California School teachers assistants, those were on strike recently. And so we walked with them and they got their contract. Those were all the UC universities in California. They were paying these TAs like $25,000 a year, but they were charging them $24,000 a year to live on campus.
Oh my gosh.
How does that work?
Yeah.
So, we have a good, strong coalition of unions that represent a lot of the employees that work at Disneyland, because they have thousands and 50,000 employees that work at Disneyland every day. So we have done a lot of actions with them and stand with them. But there's right now there's a lot of unions that are going on strike. I think there's a big movement towards feeling empowered and energized, and feeling the power of being part of a union right now. Everyone's standing up. I think there's a movement happening.
Yeah.
A resurgence, rather.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think musicians often just think, well, I want to focus on my art form and I don't want to really think about all that other stuff, but we're really no different than an Amazon worker or a Starbucks worker in terms of needing to have power in our workplace. And so it's been inspiring to see some of the other new organizing happening around the country. And I think the medieval times thing is a really interesting campaign, because most people would think, well, why would somebody who is jousting need a union, right? But again, like, entertainment workers are workers. So that's fascinating. I hope I can have one of those folks on as a guest sometime. That would be interesting to talk about what their issues are.
Oh yeah, yeah. Their union is really strong. I mean, those folks are really standing in lockstep with each other. It's awesome to see. They have, that company has I think 12 different castles, they call it, all over the country. So they're bringing in scabs from other castles to do the work. And it's unfortunate that, and we have, while I was walking the line, I haven't been out there too often. I think I'm going to go tomorrow. There are folks that are showing up with their big birthday parties and everything, and they find out that that they're on strike. And I said, you're not going to see the real knights. They're out here on the sidewalk with me.
Yeah.
The queen is right here. You're not going to see the real show. So they go in and get refunds. So it's really awesome that folks can walk up and it's a teaching moment for their kids. These families that are showing up, and the parents are like, yeah, I think we should come back after when they get a good contract, and not cross over this line. It's not good for working families. So we really cheer loudly when people get their refunds.
That's amazing. And what union are they trying to organize under? Do we know?
Yeah, it's I have it here somewhere.
Is it AGVA?
They wanted to go with AGVA, but they actually have their own name.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it right now.
Interesting.
To go with AGVA.
Well, I'm going to definitely follow that campaign and contribute where I can. I actually don't think we have a medieval times in Las Vegas, but maybe we do. I should know.
Well, you have the Excalibur, so they probably take.
Yeah, I think they did have one there for years. Interesting. So what other ways are you and your colleague Edmund, who has been a guest on the show, really engaging your members? Because one of the things that I think is really a challenge is to get musicians to understand that they're their own union, right? That it's not just you and Edmund or a president in an office.
Right. Well, there's one good example. Sometimes the members will call and complain about something that's happening, and I'll listen to them, and this during COVID, when everybody was eating outside, all the restaurants had their little parklets and their patios, and you can only eat outside. Well, the musicians were only able to work outside as well if they could work. There was hardly anyone was working, right? So there were a lot of restaurants in Fullerton here in Orange County that had musicians working out on the patios. Well, the city council decided that they were going to stop doing that after COVID was in the endemic stages, I guess. They were going to have them take away the parklets and have the restaurants move back inside. And the musicians that were playing in one of the restaurants came to us and said, well, you have to do something about this. And I said, well, let's figure out what's going on. And we found out when the city council was meeting, and we all went down there. I said, well, I'll go with you, but I want you to speak to this, to the city council. So there were a dozen or so of us that went down to the Fullerton City Council meeting and told them what it meant. Like, they hadn't considered the idea that if they do this, they weren't going to let the musicians come in and play inside. That this is the only way that they can keep working. is to keep the parklets open. So, and they also, the city council were complaining about the decibel levels. They said, well, it's just going to be too loud. Well, they had some arbitrary number about decibel levels. They had no knowledge, no understanding of sound. And so the musicians gave them a good education about decibel levels. And, the fact that an acoustic instrument like a drum can be much louder than an amplified keyboard. It could be,
Yeah.
And they just think that, if you have an amp, it's going to be too loud. So they gave them a good education about that, and the people listened. The council listened to them, and they started a whole study on decibel levels in the city. But they ended up extending that policy to let the musicians stay working outside and everyone working outside. So the musicians were so excited that they did that themselves. They went and fought for it, and they won, what they needed. They didn't need to have me go do it for them. I just showed them like what to do, like, let's find out when the meeting is, let's figure out what this is. And we put it out on our social media, and everybody go down there, and they fought for it themselves. So they really had agency over that issue, and they won. So it was awesome.
Wow, what a great, inspiring example that is.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good, organizing example too. And when we talk about organizing, we're really talking about workers in any field experiencing their collective power. And one of the sort of golden rules of organizing is that we don't want to do something for workers that they can do themselves. And this is a really good example of that. So thank you for sharing that.
Right. Yeah, that's every day. I talk to musicians every day, so we'd have these personal one-on-one conversations with each other, and we find out from them not just what's happening on the stage, but also in their whole life. So sometimes they will take a gig, and then that gig changes, and and it changes what happens at home, and they have to show up early. They have to change their babysitting schedules or what, so we try to take care of the whole musician, not just what happens on stage. So if we can, we try to talk to them about how we can, how you all you musicians can go about improving their whole life, not just what happens in the workplace. So that's another thing. Yeah.
That's really key. And I think there was a really good example of that during the Disney, I think it was a strike, and it wasn't a musician strike, it was the workers in the hotels. And, Disney, I mean, like any corporation, is saying, well, this is the bottom line. This is how much we pay. We don't want to pay more. And they actually had narratives and stories in the paper about people that were living in their cars, right? They were full-time employees and they couldn't afford housing. And so that whole worker is really key, and musicians are no different. And I think this comes back to Jim's point of somebody, saying, well, why is it costing me this much money? This seems like a really high rate for one night of work, right? But it's like, well, if you look at the whole situation, right? Somebody who has to pay their own health care because they're freelancing, somebody who needs to be proficient at a certain level and is putting in hours of unpaid practice time and things like that. So looking at us in a totality is really powerful, I think. And it's a powerful message to employers.
Right. Yeah, even the idea, like you said, that the musician, if they're hired for a one-night thing and they get paid as an independent contractor, well, they also have to pay, like you said, they have to save for their retirement, they have to pay their health insurance, they don't have unemployment insurance, so they have to save for all that, and that's all coming out of that one check. If you're a W-2 employee, you may enjoy some benefits that are employer paid. But if you're not, you have to pay all that yourself. You have to take care of your family on that one check.
Yeah.
That makes a difference too. That's another thing that we're making folks more aware about is the sometimes musicians are misclassified. They should be employees, instead of independent contractors. There's still such a thing as independent contracting. Of course, you can be your own, self-employed person. But if you're working for someone regularly, there's a good chance that you probably should be an employee, so you can enjoy those employer-paid safety nets, the Social Security and unemployment, that kind of stuff. That's another avenue that we always we work on in Local 7.
Yeah, and that's really key, because musicians often are treated as independent contractors, and the way labor law has been interpreted over the years, it hasn't helped us in that regard. So yeah, this is all, you have to take all of that into account when you think about what the fee is, right, or what you're paying for somebody's services.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, a lot of folks don't realize when they're paying for services like a caterer or a photographer or a musician, same thing, you're paying for all that, not just the 1 hour of playing the piano for your dinner party.
Yeah, and I think, again, one of the things that happens is there's a lot of false equivalencies that employers will do, and they'll say, well, I'm paying, the stagehand this much, and why am I paying you this much? And I know that arguments like that have been made in even big media contracts and stuff, and it's like, well, if you're playing somebody to play bassoon on a revival of the South Pacific or something, right? Let's say, that person might only have been hired for 2 Broadway shows in 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas the stagehand might be working every week, right, in that venue. So it's unfair sometimes to look at these things and compare them, because there really are apples and oranges, and I think that happens too often as well. And I think that's part of our role, is to make sure people understand. And I know it drove me crazy when I would hear employers, and you referred to the AM PTP, which stands for the Association of Motion Picture and Television Producers, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Talking about, well, if we did this for you, we'd have to do this for the stagehands. And it's like, well, when the stagehands make a movie, they're employed for 1 to 3 years, and musicians are going to be employed for 10 hours. So
right.
you can't compare this work if somebody's a scoring musician versus a stagehand. So I think, that's also another factor, is just how our work is so different in terms of hours, scheduling, and the type of work we're doing. So all these things, I think it's incumbent upon us. And as you've outlined here, your local does a really good job of having that come from the workers themselves, the musicians. Even talking about decibel levels with your city council, it's a great example.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending most of your afternoon with me today, Tammy. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to having a cocktail with you in a couple of weeks when you're actually in town for the AFM convention.
Oh, can't wait to see you.
You too. And I will look forward to having raising a glass with you soon. And if you want to connect with Tammy, she is on Facebook, and you can also go to Local 7's Facebook page and like it and follow it. And thank you so much, and we will see everybody next week. Thanks, Tammy.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's great to see you.
You too. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.